So, funny little anecdote before we begin. I remember back when I used to go to church. Before every single sermon, my youth pastor's wife would always sing. And this woman had an absolutely heavenly voice. And she was gorgeous. The only thing more beautiful than her was her voice. And it was so remarkable because not only was her voice soothing, but it was also powerful. She had such a strong bass in her voice. And I remember one day for the sermon, instead of our youth pastor giving the sermon, his wife gave the sermon. And she told us a story about how she almost got involved in the music industry when she was a teenager. She said that she went to a record company, barged into an executive's office, and just sang her heart out right then and there. Now, with that sort of display of pride and hubris, you'd expect the executive to throw her out, but he didn't. He was genuinely impressed with how powerful her voice was, but he was also honest with her, and he told her that if he signed her, that she'd have to do a lot of things that she didn't want to do, that she'd have to go to certain parties, dress a certain way, and cozy up to certain men. So after hearing all that, she wisely walked out the door and instead devoted her life to singing Christian music at church. Now, the reason I bring this all up is because watching the beginning of this movie and hearing the music producer character talk to his boss about this singer that just screwed him over and how bitter he is because he's the one who got her into the industry, introduced her to people, and taught her who to just hearing all of that just made me think back to that youth pastor's story and really reaffirms the fact that the music industry is garbage. Like, it's full of more scumbags than the film industry is, and that's saying something. Hey everyone, I'm Ben, your underground conductor, and welcome to Underground Cinema. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are aware of this, but coming up in the next few weeks is the 50th anniversary of Rocky Horror Picture Show. So I figured what better way to celebrate the anniversary than to start a new series of videos. So, over the next few weeks, I will be discussing the Rocky Horror Trilogy, which technically isn't actually a trilogy. It's two related films, then one unrelated film, but that one unrelated film happens to have its distribution history very closely tied to Rocky Horror Picture Show. It's something. Like, I know I'm sort of reaching here, but come on, I'm content planning. In any case, to kick off this new series of videos, we'll be starting off by talking about that one unrelated film, being Phantom of the Paradise from 1974. Actually released Halloween Day, 1974, if you could believe it. Anyway, Phantom of the Paradise was written and directed by the filmmaker Brian De Palma, and if that name doesn't mean anything to you, let me give you a refresher real quick. You see, in addition to this movie, Brian De Palma also directed Mission to Mars, Mission Impossible, Carrie, and Scarface. So, suffice to say, Brian De Palma is probably one of the greatest filmmakers of the last 50 years. Which makes it a little unfortunate the fact that this movie is probably one of his biggest failures? Not from a critical standpoint, but from a commercial one. You see, the estimated budget of Phantom of the Paradise was $1.3 million, and the initial box office revenue it generated during its initial run was only $250,000. So it only made 1/5 of its production budget back. And that's not even counting the money that it would cost for advertising. That being said, though, while it was not successful at the time, Phantom of the Paradise since then has actually developed somewhat of a cult following. And this film has such a devoted fan base now that there was actually a documentary released called Phantom of Winnipeg, which outlines the very significant cult status that this movie has specifically in the community of Winnipeg, Canada. And interestingly enough, that documentary was actually directed by Malcolm Ingram, who also directed the 1996 film Drawing Flies, which is a movie that I have reviewed. But in any case, the cult status that this film has developed over time is not only encouraging, as it sort of validates the amount of effort that Brian De Palma put into this movie when he was making it, but it's also interesting because I think you can attribute a lot of this film's popularity now to the relationship it shares with the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Now, obviously, these two films share a lot of different surface-level similarities. For one, they are both horror films distributed by 20th Century Fox. Another point to bring up would be the fact that both films are rock musicals, and probably most significant of these surface-level similarities is the fact that both films are essentially parodies of popular monster stories. Those monster stories being Phantom of the Opera and Frankenstein, respectively. I mean, even the villains in both movies were black capes with silver lining. So suffice to say, there are a lot of aesthetic similarities between Phantom of the Paradise and the Rocky Horror Picture Show. However, putting those surface-level similarities aside, Phantom of the Paradise also shares a lot of its distribution history with Rocky Horror Picture Show. For one thing, prior to becoming a movie, Rocky Horror Picture Show was actually a very popular stage musical. And if you look at some of the old playbills for the Rocky Horror Show, you can see little advertisements for Phantom of the Paradise prior to it coming out. So right then and there, the two movies shared a connection with each other even before either of them came out. Not only that, but many people may recall that the opening song of the Rocky Horror Picture Show is called Science Fiction Double Feature, which is sung masterfully by Patricia Quinn. But that song is very deliberately meant to pay homage to the various sci-fi B-movies that came out throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Movies like King Kong, The Day the Earth Stood Still, or film serials like Flash Gordon. And obviously, if you're familiar with film history, you would know that a lot of these B-movies were played as double features with different films upon release. And funny enough, while this song is mainly meant to just pay homage to the sci-fi double feature, when Rocky Horror Picture Show was initially released in 1975, 20th Century Fox thought it would be prudent of them to actually show the movie as a double feature. And the most common film that Rocky Horror Picture Show was paired with when it was being played as a double feature was Phantom of the Paradise. Now, obviously, this was very likely done to sort of recoup the losses that Phantom of the Paradise suffered during its initial theatrical run, but the fact that these two movies were paired together upon the release of the latter film, it's just really interesting and sort of demonstrates how, in a lot of ways, Phantom of the Paradise is a spiritual prequel to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And while I have no doubt in my mind that Rocky Horror Picture Show probably would have already been successful without Phantom of the Paradise, I do feel like this movie deserves more credit, because in a lot of ways it does feel like Phantom of the Paradise walked so Rocky Horror could run. But moving on from all that, you might be asking yourself, exactly what is Phantom of the Paradise about? Well, as I just mentioned, Phantom of the Paradise is by and large a parody of the classic story Phantom of the Opera. And a lot of the broad strokes of the plot are very similar to that story. Primarily a lot of the plot points surrounding this one villain who has this horrible facial deformity, and who inevitably develops an unhealthy obsession with a beautiful woman who has a very powerful voice, and how he feels like that woman's love and her music can bring meaning and beauty to his ugly life. You know, that is very much the story of Phantom of the Opera, and Beauty and the Beast, I guess. However, this movie doesn't just stop at drawing influence from Phantom of the Opera, as the film also draws heavy inspiration from the story of Faust, being the old German legend about a man who sold his soul to the devil. And you see this from the beginning of the movie, as we have the character Winslow Leech, who is literally writing a musical cantata titled Faust. And this musical cantata that he's written has drawn attention from the film's central antagonist, being Swan, played by Paul Williams. And the character of Swan wants this Faust cantata because as soon as he hears it, he sees the cantata as a gateway path to him opening the nightclub of his dreams, being the Paradise. So he sends one of his top music producers, a guy named Philbin, to get the cantata from the singer, Winslow Leech. And funny thing I noticed, I can't prove this, but I'm fairly certain that the character of Philbin is named after the actress Mary Philbin, who played Christine in the original Phantom of the Opera from 1925 with Lon Chaney. Just a funny little thing I noticed. Anyway, Philbin tricks Winslow into giving him the cantata to show to Swan, and after a month, Winslow goes to Death Records, Swan's company, to see how the cantata arrangement is coming. Of course, very obviously, neither Death Records nor Swan are at all interested in interacting with Winslow Leech in any way. They just wanted his music. And to get Winslow out of the way, they end up framing him for drug possession and sending him to prison. And after getting all of his teeth pulled out and spending 6 months in prison, he's finally had enough as he's discovered that his cantata is now being repurposed and played by a nostalgia band called the Juicy Fruits, which he despises. Winslow then breaks out of prison, goes to Death Records, and tries to destroy every single record copy of his mutilated cantata. However, he himself is mutilated in the process as his head gets caught in a record press. And as he wobbles out mutilated and gutshot, he just falls into the river, and presumed to be dead. Now, at the beginning of the film, I was very frustrated because just watching this character have his life's work be stolen from him, and seeing how his life became completely uprooted by greedy music producers, it just felt incredibly discouraging. Of course, the film showing you this tragic turn of events for the character of Winslow is meant to sort of get you on his side and set him up as the Phantom character in this story. And this is a very interesting framing, because not every version of Phantom of the Opera shows the Phantom's origin. Like the original 1925 film with Lon Chaney Sr. doesn't show his origin. It tells you about his origin, but it doesn't show it. But other versions, like the 1943 version with Claude Rains, does in fact show the Phantom's origin story. And it's kind of interesting because the 1943 version is somewhat similar to Phantom of the Paradise, in the sense that you have Claude Rains' character, Eric, become enraged, believing that his music is being stolen by a great composer. And that also leads him to getting his face mutilated and then falling into water. But the difference with the origin in Phantom of the Paradise specifically is that this version of the Phantom's backstory firmly frames him as the victim. Like, yes, his character is incredibly naive, and we see how aggressive he is from the beginning of the story, but he is firmly the underdog in this narrative. And seeing him get screwed over at every turn really works to get the audience on his side, and begin to root for him as the film goes on. And we have plenty of opportunities to root for him, as we discover, unsurprisingly, that he survived the gunshot and the facial mutilation. And after these events, he sneaks his way into this new nightclub opened by Swan, the Paradise, and he begins to disrupt everything. Of course, Swan, being a very smart character, notices immediately what's going on, discovers that Winslow has survived, and instead of throwing Winslow out of his club, he seizes an opportunity and decides to make a deal with Winslow instead. Because he recognizes Winslow's talent with music, that's why he stole the music to begin with, and he figures that if he can get Winslow to work for him, he can get more of this music. So Swan and Winslow begin working together. Winslow personally selects a singer for the new cantata, being the character of Phoenix, who's the Christine stand-in in this film. And Winslow begins to rewrite his cantata for a female singer. And to help with the composition, Swan even makes a voice synthesizer for Winslow, since his voice was destroyed in the accident. Of course, as you could tell, Swan is merely looking to use Winslow, and he even goes as far as having Winslow sign a contract in blood, which once again refers back to the various obvious parallels that this film has with the Faust myth. And since Swan's character is very clearly the devil stand-in in this movie, it's very unsurprising what happens next, as he double-crosses Winslow, and instead of having Phoenix sing the cantata, he ends up selecting an up-and-coming singer named Beef to sing the cantata. And of course, Swan double-crossing Winslow like this is a bad idea. Even the character of Beef realizes it's a bad idea, because when he's reading the music, he's able to recognize that it was written for a woman. And he's also able to recognize before the show even begins that playing around with a dead man's music was a bad idea. Honestly, Beef is kind of like an underrated character in the story, considering like how much thought he actually puts into things. It's interesting. Anyway, to keep Winslow from interfering, Swan ends up sealing Winslow into his studio. Of course, that doesn't work out at all, as Winslow breaks out, threatens Beef, and proceeds to disrupt the entire show, going as far as even killing Beef. At this point, though, this is when the character of Phoenix finally has the opportunity to showcase her singing talent. And the crowd is completely enamored, not only by the spectacle of Beef's death, but also by Phoenix's voice. And Swan, realizing the mistake he made, also seizes upon the opportunity, as he seduces Phoenix. This seduction obviously tears apart the character of Winslow, as he has been enamored with Phoenix since the first act of the film. So upon seeing the coupling of Swan and Phoenix, Winslow chooses to take his own life. Of course, that doesn't really work. You see, Swan appears and points out to Winslow that the contract that he signed is only terminated upon Swan's death, not Winslow's. So Winslow cannot die. Winslow, enraged by this, then attempts to kill Swan, but that doesn't work either, because apparently Swan himself is also under contract. Which is kind of odd, the fact that this supernatural element is introduced this late in the narrative. Of course, as we find out shortly thereafter, the reason why Winslow's suicide attempt didn't work and why Swan's contract is binding is because about 20 years earlier, Swan was going to commit suicide himself because he was getting old. But then he made a deal with the devil to keep himself young. And the way the deal was set up, it ostensibly made Swan immortal, as while he wouldn't age, the tape he used to record himself would age, very similar to Dorian Gray. And of course, much like Dorian Gray, the only way to kill Swan was to destroy the recording, which Winslow does. Of course, around this same time, Winslow finds out that Swan has not only trapped him in a contract, but also trapped Phoenix into a contract, a marriage contract, and that he's actually planning to kill Phoenix. So Winslow rushes out to stop the assassin, and then he goes on to have his final confrontation with Swan, who is burning to death because his recording is also burning. Of course, since Swan is dying, that means that the wound that Winslow has in his chest from his attempted suicide is beginning to open up. And upon his final breath, all he does is crawl towards Phoenix, the woman that he's in love with, revealing his monstrous and mutilated face in the process. Phoenix is obviously off-put by all of this, so ultimately Winslow's longing for her is to no avail, as he dies a monster, which is ultimately a tragic conclusion to his character, since he is now the only reason why she is alive. And that's how we end our film. Now, Phantom of the Paradise is a pretty stellar film, I have to admit. Obviously, I am somewhat biased, as I am a fan of Phantom of the Opera. I remember actually seeing the play on Broadway in 2012 when I was like 14 years old. And I even have a poster right here signed by the entire cast of that year. So obviously my perspective of this material is a bit skewed. But I think there's a lot of amazing elements of this story that really support it, like the music, for instance. The music in this film is absolutely phenomenal, which is very unsurprising considering that most of the music in the movie was done by Paul Williams, the guy who played Swan. And Paul Williams also wrote Rainbow Connection, the Kermit song from the Muppet movie. So it's unsurprising that the music in this movie is this good. But the film also has an amazing sense of drama, obviously stemming from the fact that it's an adaptation primarily of Phantom of the Opera. And as mentioned, the fact that you see Winslow's origin story at the beginning of the movie really helps you to get on his side. And the fact that his character becomes more and more monstrous as the film goes on, going as far as murdering people, really goes on to support the tragedy of his sacrifice at the end. That he was just a normal guy who was wronged, then became a monster, but his final act was saving someone innocent. It's truly an execution of tragedy that carries a fundamental amount of weight, and considering that this movie was done by Brian De Palma, who did Scarface, it's unsurprising that he knows how to handle tragedy. I also really love the aesthetic and tone of this film, as it is incredibly gothic, but rather than marrying those gothic tones to classical music, the film marries those gothic tones to rock music, which is a very interesting pairing that you wouldn't expect to work, but it does, and it also gives the film a somewhat psychedelic quality, which feels oddly more 60s than 70s. And something else that I really feel like complements sort of this psychedelic, gothic rock and roll aesthetic is the editing and cinematography, as both are very creative and very unique. Like, there's a lot of long shots in the film, some interesting uses of shaky cam, especially in the third act when you have the character of Winslow running to save Phoenix, and a lot of split-screen editing showing us the different perspectives of the same scene, which is obviously meant to allude to a couple different things. One, the fact that the character of Swan is probably filming these performances on separate cameras, but also because any one of those cameras could just be the perspective of the character of Winslow, since he is the phantom character in this story and since he's lurking about a lot. It's interesting. And for God's sake, if you really want to hammer home the gothic psychedelic blend that this film is aiming for, the opening narration of the movie is done by Rod Serling, the creator and host of The Twilight Zone. I remember starting the movie and hearing his voice, and I was like, wait, what the because I'm an enormous fan of The Twilight Zone, so just hearing that, I'm like, whoa, they got him? That's awesome. Anyway, another thing that really supports the gothic tone of the film is the fact that this film does draw inspiration from several different source materials. Like I mentioned, Phantom of the Opera, Faust, even, the story of Dorian Gray play factors into this narrative. But there's also a shower sequence in this movie that very directly pays homage to Psycho from Alfred Hitchcock, and that movie obviously came out in 1960. And, moving on to other eras, there's also the fact that when Beef's stage show begins at the Paradise, the stage is decorated to look like an old German expressionist town vis-a-vis the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And then there's Beef's band, who are dressed very overtly like the rock band Kiss. And interestingly enough, Kiss themselves, 4 years after this movie came out, actually starred in their own Phantom of the Opera adaptation called Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park. And going off on another tangent, that movie was produced by Hanna-Barbera, who made Scooby-Doo, obviously. And decades later, Kiss and Scooby-Doo actually did a crossover movie, which was basically a soft animated remake of Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park. Because in the Scooby-Doo movie, there's a phantom of a new theme park that's Kiss-themed. Everything just circles back. It's interesting. But, bottom line, this movie does pay homage to a lot of things, it parodies a lot of different things, makes reference to a lot of things, and this was actually a very common criticism of the film when it came out, that it was doing too many things. But I feel like pretty much all of these elements blend together more or less perfectly, as a lot of it supports this sort of gothic tone that the film is going for, but it's also blended well with the rock and roll aesthetic. And I think that overall helps to support the film, rather than detracting from it. Obviously, since I'm very well versed in storytelling and media, I was able to pinpoint and notice a lot of these references. And you can argue that those things can take you out of the film if you're familiar with that. But I feel like if you're a more passive viewer and you're just watching this movie, you can just enjoy the face-forward drama of it all. Just examining this character who's brought to his lowest point, but ultimately has to fight off the devil himself. So yeah, bottom line, the narrative references and homage I feel like really work in this film. However, I do think a legitimate criticism you can make against this movie is the fact that it does feel a little too ambitious. So like I mentioned during my plot synopsis, they introduced this supernatural element into the film kinda late in the narrative. The fact that Swan actually did make a deal with the devil, and this is what gives him all of these sort of devilish abilities, which also enables him to trap other people under contract. And because that element is introduced so late in the narrative, it makes it feel a bit jarring. Because most of the film up until that point feels pretty grounded in reality. There's some absurdist elements, obviously, aspects of this movie that do divorce it from reality, and obviously a lot of the film is also heavily satirizing how despicable the music industry is. But for the most part, putting those absurdist elements aside, it genuinely feels like this movie is mainly just set in a slightly more exaggerated version of the real world. And this is even reflected in the presentation of the film, as all the musical sequences in the film are diegetic rather than non-diegetic. And if you're unfamiliar with those concepts, diegetic music is basically when the music actually exists in the universe of the film. Like if you turn on a car radio and you hear a song, that's diegetic. Meanwhile, non-diegetic music is music that exists in the film, but it's outside of the narrative, and is meant to just be part of the film's soundtrack elevating the film. So the fact that the movie does ground itself like that does make it a bit disorientating when they introduce this supernatural element near the end of the second act. And the fact that the movie then goes on to throw all this information at you regarding Swan's deal and how he can make deals with others so late in the film, it feels overly expositional. It feels like that was an element that should have been more directly placed in Act 1, or at least implied, and then alluded to leading to a conclusion. Like, it feels like what Brian De Palma did is that he sort of just expected the fact that he made so many references to Faust in the first 2 acts of the movie that when it's eventually revealed that Swan did literally make a deal with the devil, that all of that thematic setup would inevitably lead to that narrative reveal. But it doesn't really come off that way. It sort of just comes off as the story sort of jumping the shark. Like, you can't really just introduce something like a Faustian bargain as a thematic allegory in your narrative, and then make the allegory literal once you get to the 3rd act. Like, that's a little sloppy. That being said, the fact that this film does have a supernatural element, and already does kind of have an absurd, elevated sense of reality, also kind of makes it feel like this film could exist in the Rocky Horror universe. So even though it is technically disconnected, you could watch these films one after the other and say, oh yeah, you know, this is probably the same world. And that also makes the fact that these 2 films were aired together as a double feature make even more sense. But anyway, despite my criticisms, I think Phantom of the Paradise is a pretty stellar movie. I think Brian De Palma knocked it out of the park on this film. And I think that despite the fact that Rocky Horror Picture Show is obviously the more popular movie, and even though this film does kind of jump the shark at the end, I would say that on a technical level and an emotional level, that Phantom of the Paradise is actually the stronger film. At least it's, you know, narratively cohesive and doesn't throw a million characters and side plots at you for like no reason. And frankly, I think it also has better music. Don't at me, Rocky Horror fans. I'm a fan of Rocky Horror as well. I've seen the movie like 7 or 8 times. I've been to Shadowcast shows maybe 4 or 5 times at this point. Like, I get it, but come on. You have to give credit where credit's due, and you have to admit when a movie is better. Still, who knows, maybe I'll change my mind in the next video. So, with that out of the way, that was my review of Phantom of the Paradise. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please feel free to subscribe if you're feeling generous. You can also follow me on Instagram or Letterboxd if you want to hear more of my film takes. Let me know if you're excited for the next 2 videos in my Rocky Horror trilogy of reviews. And I will see you later.